Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we're going back to the very beginning of recorded history, to the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where the world's first great civilization took shape. This is the story of the Sumerians, a people who gave us writing, the wheel, law, mathematics, and some of the earliest myths ever told. Their cities rose out of the Mesopotamian plain more than 5,000 years ago, and from them came ideas and inventions that shaped every civilization that followed. As always, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're here to wind down after a long day, or simply let your mind wander into the deep past, I'm glad you're here. Now, let's begin. At the meeting of two restless rivers, where brown water curls and eddies and the wind moves through reed beds like a whisper in tall grass, the earth invited people to stay. Long before the names Sumer and Akkad were spoken, families began to gather on the low islands and levees of southern Mesopotamia, shaping banks of clay with bare hands, testing the soil with seed, learning the moods of flood and drought. The land itself taught them patience. When the Tigris came down fast and cruel, it could shear a village from its moorings. When the Euphrates wandered and left a backwater behind, fish filled the pools and birds covered the sky. Between river and marsh there was a long conversation, and people learned to listen. The first known settlers of these deep southlands appear in the archaeological record as the Ubaid folk, steady workers who came between 6,000 and 5,000 years before the Common Era and left behind houses of packed clay, hearths still black with ash, and bowls painted in calm greens and browns. They were not kings and heroes. They were farmers and fishers and herdsmen who brought order to a difficult plain. They sowed barley and emmer wheat along natural levees where the ground rose just enough above the flood. They kept sheep and goats on the drier edges and cattle where pasture and fresh water were close. They planted date palms, whose fruit fed the household, and whose trunks and fronds became beams and mats and cord. They cut small channels from the river to the field and learned to close them at the right hour, for too much water is as cruel as too little. Their work was a quiet miracle, repeated from season to season, an early mastery of irrigation that turned swamp to garden. Clay was the great gift and the great teacher. There was no fine stone to quarry, no tall forests to fell. There was river mud, and there was Sunday. From that humble abundance they shaped walls and thresholds, plastered floors, jars for storage, stands for offerings, and small human figures with wide eyes and careful hands. They discovered that clay will take a seal, and so they carved simple stamp seals and pressed them into the soft surface of jars to mark ownership or to sanctify what rested within. They found that clay will carry a mark with perfect memory. In time that memory would grow into writing, but in these first centuries it revealed itself as tokens and tallies, small counters of baked clay kept in little envelopes to reckon flocks and sacks of grain. Even before the first signs were scratched on tablets, the urge to count and the duty to account were awake in this land. Water set the rhythm of life, and the boats that moved upon it made the plain one country. The Ubaid people built light craft from reeds bound tight and sealed with bitumen gathered from seeps where the earth bled black. These boats carried fish, grain, and pots along river and canal, and carried news between settlements. A pot that looks like any other pot to the untrained eye may betray its origin by clay and temper. Sherds of Ubaid painted ware have been found far along the Gulf Coast and out to islands beyond sight of the delta, a faint record of journeys made by careful navigators who read wind and current and the slope of the stars. Trade began as a neighborly exchange and grew into roads of water, along which moved copper from the highlands, shell and stone from far coasts, and ideas that could not be weighed but altered lives all the same. Villages took form according to the logic of the work. Houses were low and broad, often set around a central room that gathered the life of the family, with storage spaces tucked to the sides and porches open to any breeze the evening might offer. Walls were whitewashed against heat and glare. Courtyards held ovens and grinding stones, where women ground grain and baked flat loaves, where jars of fermenting mash breathed out the sour and comforting scent of beer. On the edges of the settlement, kilns glowed and cooled in turn, as potters turned the slow wheel to shape bowls and jars for cooking and for trade. Loom weights and spindle whirls show that flax and wool were spun and woven into cloth strong enough for work and fine enough for ceremony. The village was a weaving of many crafts into one life. Order, once found, invites more order. The fields needed to be watered in proper sequence, the canals opened and cleared, the levees mended before flood season. One household could not accomplish this alone. The settlement learned to act as one when water was at stake. Elders and overseers appeared, not as lords, but as stewards who could summon hands for canal cleaning and lay out the calendar of work. Where seed and water and effort have been invested, the harvest must be guarded and measured. Storehouses rose, and with them the need for guardians and for trusted bean counters who remembered how many sacks were owed and how many were delivered. The balance between household and community was delicate and had to be negotiated each season. But over time, habit matured into custom, and custom began to carry the weight of law. Religion grew from the same soil as irrigation and counting. The people of the marsh and the levee lived with forces that seemed to think and speak. Fresh water ran unseen under the earth and burst forth into sweet pools. The river rose when no rain fell on the plain. Fish and bulrush and date palm were gifts that sustained life when the world should by rights have fallen short. Gratitude took the shape of offerings placed in special rooms within the village, rooms built a little larger, a little taller, aligned with care to a plan that had meaning. The first sacred places were not yet the towering terraces of later ages, but they stood at the heart of settlements, as houses of presence where the community thanked the powers that kept water flowing and bread rising. A headman might serve as caretaker, or a woman of strong voice might pour the first libation. In these simple rites, the seeds of priesthood were sown. The plain did not teach only gentleness. The Tigris can carve new channels in a single season and leave dead water where a harvest once was certain. Salt lifted slowly through the soil when irrigation was mismanaged and showed itself as a pale crust that ate the life from wheat. Malaria slept in the marsh and woke with summer. To live here was to stand between gift and threat and to work at the balance every day. This discipline shaped the temper of the people. They became careful record keepers and shrewd observers of season and sky. They learned that time has a body and a pulse, and they learned to count its steps. From this attention came the first calendars kept to the dance of moon and river flood. From this attention came a habit of measuring that would one day divide the hour and the circle into 60 parts, though such refinements still lay ahead. Beyond the daily work, a wider pattern was taking shape. Clusters of villages began to favor certain centers where food and goods were stored and redistributed. These centers drew labor at planting and harvest, at canal digging and levee repair. They gathered offerings and hosted feasts that reconciled neighbors after quarrels. A family might gain reputation for generosity and leadership, and find itself called upon to speak for the settlement in disputes over water with the next place downriver. The first hierarchies grew slowly and were not yet palaces and courts. They were obligations remembered, debts repaid, feasts promised, and the steady habit of looking to a certain household when decisions had to be made. In all of this, there was a sense, half practical and half sacred, that the land between the rivers was a special creation. The plain is a gift of silt laid down year after year by floods that began far away in mountains no villager would ever see. Every furrow contains ground carried from 1,000 valleys. Every jar of grain is the end of a long journey that began as snow. The Ubaid folk may not have put it so, but their lives expressed it. They brought order to a land made new each year and found themselves changed by the work. They settled in places that would become Eridu and Ur and Uruk, though those names belonged to later ages. They learned, season by season, how to make a home where water is master and clay is bread and house and tablet. So the awakening began. No banners were raised, no trumpets sounded. A woman set seed in a furrow and watched the water creep along the narrow channel and trusted that barley would rise. A man patched a boat at dawn so he could reach the traps before the sun grew fierce. A child pressed a little seal into a lump of soft clay and laughed at the mark it made. These are small acts, but they are the beginnings of cities. From them grew the first shared schedules, the first common stores, the first rooms that belonged to a god. The plain between the rivers did not simply receive people, it made them into something new. On a low rise at the edge of marsh and river, where sweet water wells up from the deep places of the earth, the Sumerians would later point and say that kingship first descended from heaven. They called that place Eridu. To them, it was not only a city, but a beginning. In their king list, the first names wear crowns that shine with impossible years. Alulim rules for an age, then Alalga, then others whose spans belong to story more than to ledgers. The tale tells us what the ground itself suggests. Before there were palaces and courts, there was a sacred house that drew people to it, and around that house a settlement grew. Eridu began as a sanctuary of reeds and clay raised against the wet. The earliest shrine was small and careful. A central room faced a sacred niche, with offering table and low altar set by the wall. The plan is simple. A long room with side chambers that serve the rite and the keeper. Later, builders returned to the same plan and rebuilt on the same spot again and again, each time raising the floor, enlarging the walls, thickening the platform, leaving a stack of temples layered one upon another like the rings of an old tree. When the last storm had carried the last wind-blown grain of dust across the threshold, the mound that covered these houses of worship stood like a book of time. To cut into it is to turn pages. Under one plastered floor lies another. Under one mud brick wall lies the trace of an older wall. At the very bottom, there is only reed and packed earth and the memory of first faith. The god of Eridu was Enki, lord of the sweet waters that flow beneath the ground. His house was called E-Abzu, the house of the deep. In later hymns, he is the keeper of wisdom, patron of craft, a sly and beneficent power who brings gifts to humankind. In the south, the gift that mattered most was water, and water was Enki's to command. It is no small thing that the first temple of the plain rose over a spring. The sanctuary marked a place where the river under the world touched the light. Pilgrims came with jars of barley and baskets of fish. They poured libations and left figurines with wide eyes that never close. They asked for steady floods and clean channels and healthy children. The god was the household head of the city. His temple was his home, and the city served as his household. The temple made order out of labor. Canals must be dug and kept clear. Sluices must be opened and closed at the right moment. Levees must be mended before the river grows unruly. A single family cannot keep the water in hand. The sanctuary stood at the center of a widening circle of obligation. Fields near Eridu were marked out as belonging to the god. Tenant families farmed them and brought a share of grain to the storehouses that stood within the sacred precinct. Fishermen and reed cutters did the same with their catch and their bundles. Herds grazed on temple pasture. Looms turned temple wool into cloth. In return, the temple distributed rations at measured intervals. Barley and beer and oil set out to the right persons in the right amounts. Clay tablets would one day record these distributions with neat signs and careful numbers, but the practice itself is older than writing. The sanctuary kept account in memory and in objects. Counters of baked clay and sealed envelopes of clay were the first quiet script of the temple household. The buildings at Eridu bore the mark of a people learning the craft of permanence. Earliest walls were of mud plastered smooth and bright, their edges strengthened with timber and reed. Later walls were thicker and carried shallow external buttresses, the first steps toward the recessed and projected facades that would one day decorate great terraces. Floors were resurfaced often, each coat of clean plaster, a renewal of sacred space. Low platforms for offerings stood where the light fell best. A few walls carried simple painted bands. The builders paid attention to alignment. Entrances stood on a straight axis with the inner niche, so that one who entered moved forward into the sight of the god. With each rebuilding, the sanctuary grew higher and more commanding. The platform rose above the houses of the settlement. From the marsh edge, a traveler could see white walls and the movement of processions and hear the chant of the priestly singers. In this way, the temple taught the village to look upward and to gather. Eridu's stores and feast days became the pulse of community life. At harvest time, teams brought in grain from temple fields and stacked it in bins. On a chosen day, the doors were opened, and elders, workers, and officials received measured shares. Great pots of beer were drawn for the festival of the god. Meat was roasted, bread was broken. The poor and the stranger stood within the same court as landholders. To live in the god's city was to share in his bounty. The feast did more than feed. It reminded each person of ties that reached beyond blood and house. It turned work into ritual, and ritual into law. Year by year, custom narrowed into rule. From these rules, the first civic authority took shape. There is evidence that the sanctuary commanded craft as well as field. The clay of Eridu yielded vessels of a kind recognizable across the south, green and brown paint laid on in calm patterns that speak of restraint and skill. Potters learned to turn clay faster. Kilns grew hotter and more reliable. Bitumen sealed jars against water, and boat hulls against the constant soak of the marsh. There are traces of early copper gathered from distant hills and hammered into small tools and ornaments. Shell from far coasts found its way into beads and inlays. The temple was a market as well as a shrine. It called men from other settlements to offer obsidian blades, colored stone, and rare timbers. It sent out fish and dates and finished goods in return. The god's house sat at the meeting of gift and price. It kept the lists and held the weights. The priests of Eridu were servants in a very practical sense. They herded labor as well as sheep. They judged quarrels over water and property. They tended calendars. In a land where months are born from the moon, the proper keeping of time is an act of governance. When would workers be summoned to clear the main canal? When would farmers open secondary cuts to their plots? When would the sanctuary receive first fruits? The answer to each question began at the temple. The high keeper and his assistants set the days. What began as a schedule of work became a sacred round of observances, and the sacred round taught the people to think of themselves as a city. From Eridu, the idea of the temple city traveled. At Ur, at Uruk, at Lagash, sanctuaries rose on platforms. Their tripartite halls and axial plans echo a pattern first explored here. The house of the god was not only a place where heaven touched earth, it was the organizing mind of early urban life. Within its walls, craft was coordinated, food was stored and weighed, and the young learned the measures a scribe must know. The temple did not keep spears and helmets in the earliest days. It kept plumb lines and basket cords. Out of those cords came straight walls and level floors, and a habit of precision that would one day give birth to written numbers and written words. The people remembered all this in story. When they spoke of a time before the flood, they named Eridu first. When they told how wisdom came to men, they told it as a gift from Enki, who sits in the deep and sends counsel up through springs. The stories grew with the city, and each new rebuilding of the temple added weight to the old claims. The sanctuary was old because the earth beneath it was old, and the rites were true because they had been performed there for the days of the grandfathers of grandfathers. In a plain without stone, time is built of clay. The piled platforms and superimposed shrines of Eridu turned clay into memory. By the late Ubaid centuries, Eridu looked like a true center. The sacred house stood high on its platform. The court below was paved and kept clean. Granaries lined one side. Workshops crowded another. A gate opened to a canal where reed boats slid in with cargo and slid out again with offerings for allied shrines. Beyond the sacred precinct, houses formed tidy quarters with lanes tamped hard by many feet. Fields spread toward the horizon along straightened watercourses. This was not yet a kingdom. It was a community under a god, stable enough and rich enough to imagine more. Out of such imagining, the next change would come. The temple taught people to gather. The schedule it kept taught them to live by common time. The stores it held taught them to count and to trust the record. The court it paved taught them to come before a rule that was larger than any single household. From these lessons, the first cities were born. From Eridu, the idea moved upriver to a place that would outgrow its teacher and give the world a new order. When the southern plain learned to think in cities, it spoke the name Uruk. On the ground today, the ancient mounds are called Waka, but in the 4th millennium, before the Common Era, The place was already a web of canals and quays, workshops and shrines, with smoke from kilns rising in a haze above bright, plastered walls. The city did not spring up in a single season. It thickened and rose through centuries of rebuilding. Archaeologists speak of levels at Uruk as if they were chapters. Early Uruk begins around the 39th to 38th century, before the Common Era. Middle Uruk runs roughly from the 38th to the 35th. Late Uruk, from about the 34th to the early 32nd, each level leaves its own fingerprints in brick and clay. By the end of this long growth, the settlement covered hundreds of hectares and likely held tens of thousands of people. It was a density that the world had not yet seen on this scale. Uruk took form around two great sacred districts. On one rise stood the precinct of An, the high sky god. Its crown in the late Uruk period was a shining white temple set upon a stepped platform that modern scholars call the White Temple. Beneath it lies the massive core of the An Terrace, built of millions of molded bricks and faced with clean gypsum plaster. On another rise to the southeast spread the Eanna precinct, dedicated to Inanna, lady of the city and mistress of love and war. Here builders experimented with new ways to make clay splendid. They drove thousands of colored cones of baked clay into wet plaster to create walls that glittered in patterns of red and black and cream. They set limestone that had come from far uplands into foundations as if to proclaim that even stone would serve on this alluvial plain. Through the Eanna courtyards, processions moved on festival days, and in its storerooms the city kept grain, wool, and oil measured out in careful rations. The city was a machine for work as well as worship. Mass-craft production first becomes visible in Uruk with a clarity that surprises. Potters adopted a true fast wheel and learned to throw vessels by the hundreds in a single round of firing. The most common form is a thick-walled little bowl with a simple straight rim and a flat base. Scholars call it a bevel rim bowl and debate its purpose. Many believe it was a standard measure for rations. The usual capacity falls close to 1 liter, though sizes vary from about 8/10 of a liter to a little over 1 liter. Some were used to bake a single portion of barley bread. Others were vessels for issuing a gruel of barley and beer to laborers at the end of the day. These bowls are everywhere in late Uruk levels, piled as discard beside kilns and heaped in middens, the pottery echo of a city that fed and paid its workers with measured portions. Administration grew to match the scale of production. Long before letters, the plain had counted with tokens of clay and sealed them inside clay envelopes called bulai. In Uruk, one sees the moment when clay counting turns into clay writing. First come tablets with only numerical signs and commodity marks. Soon after appear proto-writing tablets with lists and accounts. The earliest true tablets at Uruk are dated by context to the late 4th millennium, around the period scholars label Uruk Level 4 and Level 3. On their faces are incised neat columns of signs that stand for barley, beer, fish, textiles, livestock, and the professions that manage them. The marks are pressed with a cut reed that leaves a straight wedge or a pointed wedge. From this simple tool comes the script that later ages will call cuneiform. The city also multiplies cylinder seals in this time. A seal, carved from stone, is rolled across damp clay to leave a continuous scene. One seal might show a banquet with dignitaries drinking beer through straws from a shared jar. Another shows a file of animals led to sacrifice. Every seal says this is mine or this transaction is true. Sealings from doors and jars survive by the hundreds, each a small receipt from a lost day in the life of a busy place. The Eanna precinct has yielded some of the earliest narrative art in the world. A tall stone vessel known as the Waka vase shows a procession of offering bearers moving in ordered rows. At the base grow barley and reeds. Above them walk animals of the herd. Above them men carry baskets and jars. At the top, a robed figure presents goods to a great lady who stands before a shrine. The arrangement reads like a theology in pictures. Nature offers its produce. Humans harvest and prepare. The city brings gifts to the goddess who is the city's heart. In the same levels was found the legendary Mask of Waka, a carved female face with heavy lids and strong cheeks, once inlaid with precious stones and metals. It is one of the earliest naturalistic faces in stone known from Mesopotamia. Such objects are not trinkets. They are the image of a society that had leisure for beauty because it had learned to organize labor on a new scale. Urban life at Uruk rests on water that is tamed by effort. The Euphrates in this age shifted across the plain, leaving levees and back channels like the ribs of a great fish. The city bound itself to the river with canals cut to depth and lined where possible with bundled reeds and bitumen. Quays gave onto basins where boats of reed and wood moored tight. Through this water network came timber from the north, copper from the east, and stones from distant places that had none of the city's mud but all of its hunger for exchange. There is evidence of far-flung Uruk enclaves in this period. At Habuba Kabira, on the Euphrates, in today's Syria, at Jebel Aruda, not far away, and at Godin Tepe, in the Zagros foothills, one finds Uruk-style buildings, seals, and bevel rim bowls. The city was sending out its methods with its people. Some sites read like trading stations, others like colonies planted to control river traffic and mountain routes. North and east of Sumer, at Tel Brak and in the Susiana Plain, Uruk hallmarks show that ideas and officials traveled with goods. Within the walls, if we may trust later tradition and the traces of fortification that archaeologists have found, Uruk was bound by a vast circuit of brick. The Epic of Gilgamesh praises the Great Wall and bids the traveler to read the foundation deposit and to inspect the base, which was laid with baked brick set in bitumen. The circumference given in the poem is more than 9 kilometers. Whether that number is exact or not, the size fits what survey has found for later phases. City growth took a familiar pattern. Sacred precincts sat high on platforms. Around them clustered elite residences and administrative buildings. Workshops packed into quarters near the canals. Pottery kilns and flint workshops lie where the wind would carry smoke away from the Sacred Heart. In poor quarters, walls are thinner, floors are of beaten clay, and hearths are simple circles of scorched earth. In rich houses, rooms gather around central courtyards, with drains lined in baked brick and storage jars sunk in the floor to keep oil and beer cool. The city taught people new habits of time and number. The priests and overseers in the Eanna and in precincts kept calendars tied to the moon and to the work of irrigation. They cut the year into named months. They counted days for clearing canals and for harvest. They fixed festival dates when rations were increased and when processions moved through the streets. The metrologies that underlie the tablets of Uruk reveal counting systems based on 60 and on other counting families that suit grain, land, and labor. These are not dry facts. They are the scaffolding that holds urban life together. When a worker knows that a bowl marks his portion for the day, and that a mark on clay stands for that portion everywhere in the city. He lives inside a world where promise can be stored and trust can be carried from one room to another without the speaker present. Technology advanced because the city demanded it. Brick-making became a science. Builders preferred a plano-convex brick that could be laid quickly in patterns that knit walls strong. Bitumen was refined to seal drains and to caulk boat seams. Copper from Oman and from the Iranian highlands found its way into chisels and adzes and fishhooks. Early evidence of the saw and of the bow drill appears in tool marks on wood and stone. Weavers in the city worked temple wool into cloth in large rooms, where dozens of loom weights line the floor in regular rows. Brewers perfected thick, sweet beer that appears so often in seals and on lists of rations. Bakers used molds to standardize loaves. Herds were counted and penned with a rigor that turns up in tablets as numbers of ewes, rams, and lambs, and as lists of milk and cheese. The urban revolution at Uruk is not only a rise in scale, it is a change in kind. Villages had overseers. Uruk had a structured bureaucracy that could assign labor, track it, and pay it. Villages had shrines. Uruk had temple households with hundreds of dependents and the means to deploy them. In this period, we also see the first hints of rule that is separate from priestly service. Large residential buildings with reception rooms and facilities for storage and redistribution appear near, but not inside the sacred zones. Some scholars see in these the early palace. Whether or not a king in the later sense already sat there, the architecture itself suggests the emergence of a courtly sphere alongside the temple. The city was learning to carry more than one center of gravity. Uruk also created a literature of images that proclaimed how the world was supposed to work. Cylinder seals from late Uruk and Jemdet Nazar scenes show hero figures grappling lions and bulls, mythic combat that later Sumerian art will repeat in finer lines and harder stone. Banquet scenes with seated guests and musicians fix an ideal of elite life that will echo for centuries. The city imagined itself while it built itself. That act of imagination is a hard fact. A society that pictures order with such confidence is building institutions to match. By the close of the Uruk period, the city had exported its ways along the rivers. Habuba, Kabira, and Jebel Aruda were abandoned after a short life, but their ground plans and their stores of Uruk-style jars and bowls reveal an administrative reach beyond the homeland. In the Susiana plain around Susa, Uruk influence is deep and sustained. At Tel Brek in the north, monumental buildings of this age speak of local centers responding to and competing with the southern model. The plain itself is now a landscape of peers and rivals. Kish and Nippur become names of weight. Ur begins to rise. Lagash grows bold. The age of standalone villages is over. The age of city-states begins. Uruk's achievement has numbers and objects to prove it. Tablets with thousands of entries. Kilns with dumps that hold tons of failed bowls. Foundations built with bricks, stamped with standard inscriptions. Stone and metal and shell brought from ranges and coasts that no farmer in Eridu would ever have seen. It also has a voice preserved in story. Later, poets put words in the mouth of Gilgamesh and made him the builder of the wall and the lord of splendid Uruk. They praised the ramparts and told the listener to climb them and to examine the foundation deposit. That voice knows what the ground itself confirms. Uruk was the first city that looked like a city in the full sense and acted like one every day. The name of Uruk became a story that walked on 2 feet. In later poems, the city speaks through a king whose fame reached where caravans could not. On the Sumerian king list, his name is written as Bilgames. In Akkadian copies, it becomes Gilgamesh. The list calls him the 5th ruler of Uruk after the flood and grants him an impossible span of years. Such spans belong to legend, but the man behind the legend shows through in older Sumerian songs that treat him as a fighting ruler with a mother named Ninsun and a father named Lugalbanda. A brief chronicle known as the Tamil inscription even places Gilgamesh in a sequence of real kings who restored the sacred center at Nippur. The tradition is tangled, but a core of memory remains. A war leader of Uruk lived in the early 3rd millennium before the Common Era, and his deeds were sung until they grew into a universe. Uruk in his day was already a masterpiece of brick and schedule. The prologue of the later epic invites the listener to climb the wall and walk upon its crest, and to read the foundation deposit of baked brick set in bitumen. The poem gives the circuit an extravagant measure, but the ground agrees that Uruk carried a great ring with canals inside the line and gardens and fields beyond. From that circuit, the king looked out on the twin precincts of An and Inanna, on quays crowded with reed boats, on kilns and granaries and long rows of bevel rim bowls stacked like a dry river of clay. This is the city that raised the man who would later be remembered as 2 parts divine and 1 part mortal. That mixed nature is not a dogma. It is a way of saying that the king of Uruk stood with 1 foot in the world of men and 1 in the world of the powers that kept river and harvest in balance. The oldest Sumerian tales place this king in a recognizably human setting. In the song called Gilgamesh and Aga, the ruler of Kish demands that Uruk submit the elders of the city council prudence. The men of the assembly council resistance. Gilgamesh listens and then calls out the able citizens, defeats Aga of Kish, and wins freedom for Uruk. The scene is precious because it shows councils, assemblies, and a king who must persuade as well as command. It mirrors a political world we can touch. Kish claimed a kind of primacy over the plain. Uruk rejected that claim and asserted its own right to decide. Beneath the later splendor of cedar forests and distant seas, there is a city that knew negotiation, levy, and the price of rebellion. Around these human bones, a larger body of myth gathered. In Sumerian poems, preserved in later copies, we meet a companion named Enkidu, a wild man formed by the goddess of birth to match the strength of Gilgamesh. A temple woman named Shamhat brings Enkidu into human life with bread and beer and patient teaching. The 2 men wrestle, find in each other a measure, and swear a friendship that becomes the spine of the stories. They set out to the cedar country to the west, a land that the scribes of Mesopotamia knew by its fragrant wood and its steep ridges. There they face the guardian called Huwawa, whom later Akkadian versions name Humbaba, a creature of mountain and storm. In art from the same broad age, we see heroic figures wrestling lions and bulls. In the poems, the 2 friends defeat the Watcher of the forest, cut cedar, and bring home timber to a land that had little of it. The memory preserves a fact behind the tale. Southern cities needed cedar for roofs and doors and ceremonial boats. Expedition and contract brought it down the river valleys. The journey to the forest is both a mythic trial and a practical line of supply told large. The other great tale of their courage brings the wrath of a goddess. When the king of Uruk returns in victory, Inanna, whom the Akkadians called Ishtar, sets her desire upon him. He refuses and recounts the fate of her former lovers, men and even creatures of the fold who came to bad ends once the goddess had tired of them. The refusal is a bold thing in a city where the Iana precinct is her house. Inanna rises to the sky god and obtains the bull of heaven as a punishment. The bull descends, cracks the earth, kills people in the streets. Gilgamesh and Enkidu face it and kill it. They keep the thigh as a trophy and insult the goddess in her anger. The gods then decide that one of the two friends must pay. Enkidu sickens and dies after a long dream of the underworld. The poem lingers on the king's grief. He touches the face that no longer speaks. He refuses burial until a worm falls from the nose. It is a detail that draws breath from the reader because it is so plain. In a world that filled tombs with lyres and gold and sacrificed retainers, death remains a fact that stares back. The death of the friend forces a change. Gilgamesh looks at the wall of Uruk and sees it as a fence that cannot keep out time. He sets out to find a man who did what no man does. In the Akkadian version, the old survivor is called Utnapishtim. He lives at the mouth of the rivers in a place that some later texts name Dilmun, a bright land near the Gulf where the waters are sweet. To reach him, the king passes through a mountain gate kept by scorpion people, crosses a road of 12 double hours in perfect dark, walks a garden where stone trees bear fruit, and then finds the ferryman Urshanabi who helps him cross the waters of death. The old man receives him and tells a flood story that is the heart of Tablet 11 in the later compilation. The gods grew tired of human noise and sent a flood to end them. Ea, who is Enki, whispered the secret to a reed wall, and so saved the wise man and his household. When the waters went down, the boat grounded. The survivor sent out birds, made sacrifice, and received life that does not end as a gift. This telling shares lines with an older poem that we call Atrahasis. It also shares its curve with the flood story in the Hebrew book of Genesis. The connection is not an opinion. It is a trail of cuneiform signs that can be followed across tablets and centuries. When Gilgamesh asks for the same gift, he is given a test that he fails. He cannot keep sleep at bay for 7 days. He then learns of a plant that can make the old young again. He finds it by diving to the sea floor and cutting it free. On the road home, a serpent smells the plant, takes it, and crawls away. The snake sheds its old skin and is renewed, while the king sinks down and weeps. He returns to Uruk without a talisman and without his friend, but with a knowledge that is not small. He shows the ferryman the wall. He points to the foundation. He tells him to read the brick. The ending is not despair. It is an acceptance that a human life is bounded and that a city of brick and custom can hold a name longer than any limb can hold strength. The poems themselves carry a story of their making. The earliest written glimpses of Gilgamesh come in Sumerian on separate songs about Huwawa, about the bull, and about a frantic search for a drum and ball lost to the underworld. In that last piece, Enkidu descends and breaks the rules of the dead. He sits, he eats, he embraces. Each act steals from him. In time, he returns and tells what the underworld is like for men of different fates, a catalogue that reads like a guided tour of fear and comfort. In the old Babylonian age, roughly the 18th century before the Common Era, a longer Akkadian version takes shape on clay. The standard Babylonian form, known from the library at Nineveh, is a dozen tablets long and was probably given its final form by a scholar named Sinleki Unnini. Tablet 12 is a late edition that adapts the Sumerian underworld tale to the Akkadian cycle. The Nineveh tablets lay buried in the palace mound until the 19th century of our own era. Excavators carried them to a museum in London. In the year 1872, a young assistant named George Smith read the floodlines in Tablet 11 to a stunned room. Newspapers shouted the discovery, and the ancient king of Uruk walked again through modern streets. The epic is not a simple fantasy. It preserves the memory of Uruk as a place of law and engineering. It remembers cedar from the west, and copper from the east, and lapis from lands beyond the two rivers. It gives names that bind myth to the map. Marshu is a gate of the mountains. Dilmun is a shore near the sunrise. It knows the tools of urban life. Beer is drunk through long straws from a common jar. Seals are rolled over wet clay to make contracts true. Priests and dream interpreters stand beside the king. The gods are many, but they behave like solemn witnesses for the rights that hold society together. When Gilgamesh offends the goddess, he is not simply punished for pride. He has insulted a pillar of the city by breaking decorum. Archaeology adds footnotes to the tale. In the Eanna precinct, the Waka vase and the marble face that was once inlaid with precious materials show the city at the time when the oldest parts of the legend were being shaped. The Bevel rim bowl dumps speak of rations to hired hands. Clay tablets from late Uruk and Jemdet Nasser already record wool, barley, and beer in regular allotments to workers. The cedar beams and doors that supported great halls at Uruk needed mountains to the west. The very platform of the White Temple holds bricks stamped with marks set in careful rows, a habit of account and public display that later generations would take for granted. The legend does not invent the wall. It uses the wall as proof that a city and its builders can leave a mark that time must respect. There is a further reach to the figure of Gilgamesh. In the wider literature of Sumer and Akkad, he appears not only as a hunter of monsters, but as a judge of wisdom. In the late dialogue known as Theodicy, the speaker lists the injustices of the world and wonders why the gods permit them. In other wisdom texts, the name of Gilgamesh stands as an authority whose voice is worth hearing. A figure who begins as a builder and fighter becomes in later hand a guardian of sayings. This change mirrors the fate of Sumerian culture itself, which after the fall of the Sumerian cities lived on as a language of learning and ritual in Babylonian schools. What then do we learn when we walk with this king along the east wall at dusk? We see that a city is both brick and story. We see that the search for a life without end turns finally into care for a name that others will carry. We see that the first great literature of the world rose from a place where ration bowls and cylinder seals and water levels filled the days. The songs remember a man, but they honor the society that taught him to weigh, to plan, and to leave his work in public sight. That is why the last lines of the standard version bring the listener back to Uruk and bid him to look upon the wall. When villagers learned to count in thousands, and temples learned to feed a city, pride and worry walked in the same streets. The plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates became a chessboard of sacred capitals, each city a household of a god, with fields, canals, workshops, and a wall that promised safety. Kish claimed a senior voice and styled its ruler King of Kish. a title that meant more than one city and less than the world. Uruk kept the old memory of first greatness. Ur guarded the wealth of the moon god. Lagash worked hard and watched its borders. Umma looked across the canal at land it believed should be its own. Each city could summon labor for canals and levy men for war. Each kept scribes to count rations and priests to keep the calendar. When water is life, a boundary is not a line on sand. It is the difference between full granaries and hunger. So, the first long wars of history began not for gold and not for an idea, but for irrigation rights and the right to speak first at Nippur. Nippur sat near the middle of Sumer, with no crown of its own. It was the house of Enlil, lord of wind and command, and the place where kingship was said to be confirmed. A ruler who wished to claim seniority over his peers did more than win a battle. He came to the Ekur temple at Nippur and received the favor of Enlil. That favor was a political truth dressed in holy clothing. It kept a fragile order among proud neighbors. The title King of Kish could move from one city to another as fortunes changed. But the blessing at Nippur gave the move a face that the gods could own. The earliest famous quarrel on the southern plain set Lagash against Umma over a fertile stretch called the Gu Edena, the edge of the plain. The claim was old, even when the first texts that name it were written. A king of Kish named Mesilim, who likely ruled around the middle of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, judged the dispute and set a boundary. He dedicated a stele to fix that judgment and called the gods to witness. Time wore away the peace. An Ensi of Umma named Ush broke the markers and dug into fields that Lagash believed belonged to Ningirsu, the warrior god of Lagash. Yanatum of Lagash raised men and marched. On the carved limestone that we call the Stele of the Vultures, the troops of Lagash advance in a tight block with long spears and large rectangular shields. The god Ningirsu strides larger than life and nets the enemies of his city. Vultures pick at the bodies on the ground. The message is exact and without poetry. A boundary was crossed. Lagash punished the trespass. The stele is both record and threat. Eonatum did not stop with a single victory. Around 2450 to 2425 before the Common Era, he forced Umma to swear to keep the boundary, paid an indemnity in grain, and acknowledged the claim of Ningirsu over the disputed land. He also campaigned beyond his neighbor. In later lists and in fragmentary inscriptions, he appears as a rare thing in this age, a man who could compel several cities at once. He boasted of victories at Ur, at Uruk, and even against Elamite towns to the east. His realm was not an empire in the later sense. It was a set of oaths kept so long as the sword was close by, but it was larger than the old parish wars of village against village. After Eonatum came his kinsman Enmetena, who renewed the treaty with Umma in precise terms. Enmetena's foundation cones record field measures, water obligations, and curses for violators. The language is dry and therefore powerful. An iku of land is named, a canal is named, a penalty is set in grain. These lines tell us how Sumer fought, and they tell us how Sumer tried to stop fighting. The soldiers of this world were citizens, called out from field and workshop when the temple and the palace sounded the summons. The word for a soldier is erin. Officers used reed lists to count men and to fix rations. On the famous war panel of the Standard of from royal graves that date around 2600 before the Common Era, infantry march in ranks, captives are brought before a seated ruler, and heavy carts rattle across the ground behind onagers with grooms at their heads. These are not horses. The true horse will come much later from far steppes. The vehicles are four-wheeled battle wagons with solid wheels that carry a driver and a spearman. They break lines and chase down fugitives. Foot soldiers carry long spears, axes, and maces. Helmets of hammered copper protect the head. Cloaks of layered felt or leather give some guard to the body. The steel of the vultures shows a shield wall that advances with discipline. We are watching the first formations that we can name without guessing. Politics was a system of titles as well as spears. An NC is a city governor, often a prince of a powerful family, and a priestly figure in the city god's house. A Lugal is a great man, a king in the stronger sense, who claims authority beyond a single city. Gilgamesh is styled Lugal of Uruk in the tradition that bears his name. Eonatum of Lagash called himself both Ensi of Lagash and king over lands he had forced to obey. Rival cities used these titles to argue for place in a world where every rank carried a ration and every claim carried a weight at Nippur. When we say that Lugal-Zaggisi of Umma later made himself king of Sumer, we are summing many inscriptions where he claims to have imposed order on cities that had known only their own will. The rise of Lugal-Zaggisi shows the speed with which fortune shifts on the plain. The house of Lagash held the advantage for a time. The monuments praise Ningirsu and the careful rule of Urukagina, who is remembered for reforms that curbed the abuses of officials and restored property to temples and commoners. Even as he wrote his reforms, the storm gathered in the west. Lugal-Zaggisi took Umma, then took Lagash, then made Uruk his capital, and boasted that from the lower sea to the upper sea, he had set things in their right places. The lower sea is the Gulf. The upper sea is the distant Mediterranean. The boast is larger than the map will bear, but the claim tells us he did more than raid. He held a chain of cities long enough and far enough to speak as a single lord. The Sumerian king list grants him a span of 25 years before another name from the north will sweep him away. Behind the clamor of conquest, daily life still ran on measured lines. Canals were opened in the 2nd month and shut in the 8th, or according to local calendars that had their own names for the same work. Temple warehouses recorded barley by the gur and land by the bur. Cylinder seals rolled over wet clay to mark that wool had been issued to women who would weave it into cloth at home and return it at a fair count. When the levy drew men from the fields, storehouses increased rations for their families. When festivals filled the city courts, rations of beer rose with them. A city at war keeps books, if it wishes to live through winter. The tablets that survive from Lagash and Umma in the time of these quarrels mention not only the fines for boundary breaking, but also lists of fish, lists of sheep and goats, and the wages for boatmen who hauled barley on the canals that the war was meant to defend. Religion did not sit apart from these events. Each city fought under the eye of its patron god. Lagash marched for Ningirsu. Umma swore by Shara. Ur prayed to Nanna for safe roads and full storehouses. When a boundary was set, both sides called their gods to witness. When a treaty was inscribed, curses were written for any ruler who would move the stone, and excuses were written for any officer who might be compelled to do so by his master. Processions at Nippur made a show of unity, even when unity had to be carried in one hand with a spear in the other. In this age, Law and cult and politics are a single braid. By the end of this era, the map of Sumer is a field of rivals that know one another and copy one another. The habit of keeping law in writing has begun. The habit of bringing disputes before a third party has begun. The habit of using titles to gather many cities under one hand has begun. The habit of using seals and tablets to manage armies and provisions has begun. From these habits, a new kind of ruler will rise, who does not care who holds the title King of Kish, so long as all the cities pay the same tax. He will come from the north, and he will teach Sumer the meaning of empire. A Sumerian city was a house with many rooms. At its sacred core stood the temple of the city god, a household in its own right with fields, herds, workshops, and a calendar of offerings. Around that core stretched administrative courts, markets under shade roofs, lanes of modest houses, and quarters of craftsmen, where kilns glowed and metal rang on stone. Beyond the walls lay the country that fed it all, a grid of canals, feeder ditches, and fields measured with care. The life of the city turned on three disciplines that the Sumerians raised to an art. They mastered water, they mastered number, and they learned to bind quarrels with words that stayed put. Daily work began in the fields. Barley was the sure grain because it endured salt better than wheat. Date palms stood at levee edges, where their long roots drank deep and their crowns gave shade to plots below. Oxen drew the ard plough through wet soil. Cedar ploughs that dribbled grain into the furrow appear in early depictions and made sowing faster and more even. Farmers timed irrigation by the moon and by a rule of thumb learned from fathers and uncles. Too much water whitened the ground with salt. Too little left young barley to wither. So sluices were opened and shut on appointed days, and the main canals were cleared in a set month before the river rose. Fish taken from canals and from backwaters filled many pots, along with onions, leeks, pulses, and bread baked from coarse barley meal. Beer thick enough to drink with a straw was both ration and comfort. Oil pressed from sesame or rendered from animals flavored the pot. This was the first cuisine of cities, and it was honest and sustaining. The temple ran an economy that reached from quay to threshing floor. Plots were assigned to dependents on terms set in clay. Herds grazed on temple ranges under the count of inspectors. Loom rooms in the sacred precincts and in city quarters turned wool from flocks into cloth in organized batches, with wool issued and finished cloth returned against a tablet receipt. Brewers and bakers drew measured grain and handed back beer and bread in agreed amounts. The city paid many of its workers with rations rather than coin, for coin did not yet exist here. Tablets from storehouses list barley, oil, and beer, issued by the siler and by larger measures. The small bevel rim bowl that crowds laid uruk dumps may have served as the standard portion, a humble clay cup that carried the arithmetic of a city in its shape. Scribes stood at the center of this order. A boy who entered the tablet house learned first to make a tablet from wet clay of the right temper, then to hold a cut reed to make clean wedges at the proper angle. He copied lists until they were in his hand and in his sleep. Lists of numerals and measures, lists of professions and officials, lists of birds and trees and stones. Then came model contracts and receipts. Then came mathematics, where capacity measures, length measures, and land measures each had their own number signs. The Sumerians favored a sexagesimal way of reckoning that lies behind our 60 minutes and our 360 degrees. Capacity was reckoned from the sila, that is about the volume of a litre. Large quantities were counted in the gur, which held a few hundred sila depending on the period. Land was surveyed in the iku, a square field that later tradition fixed as 100 cubits by 100 cubits. The city that could measure its fields and count its rations could levy fair work and make fair payment. When the city learned to put those measures in clay, memory grew longer than any one lifetime. Law grew first, as custom remembered by elders and priests, and then as decisions written down, so that an official could not quietly change the weight of justice. From the early dynastic age, we meet contracts that settle marriage, sale, adoption, and debt. A typical marriage tablet names the parties, the bride gift, the dowry, and the witnesses, then calls on the city god to punish any who would break the terms. Adoption could secure an heir for a house that lacked a son, with the adopted required to care for aged parents and to receive a set share of land and goods. Debt contracts name the principal, the term, and the security put up. Witnesses are listed. Seals are rolled over the wet clay to certify the terms. In disputes, men swore oaths by the god of the city. In hard cases, the river ordeal appears in later records, where the accused entered the water so that the god might judge. A man who swore and survived could go free. A man who swore lightly and sank had made the case for his accuser. The written word reached beyond bookkeeping into reform. At Lagash, a ruler named Urukagina set down a list of wrongs that he would no longer allow. He swore that priests and officials would stop seizing boats and oxen without payment. He declared that burial fees would be limited and that the poor would not be forced to sell themselves or their children for trifles. He tried to break the habit of petty theft clothed as tax. Only fragments survive, but they are enough to show a program that defended commoners against 1,000 small cuts. It is not a code article by article in the later manner. It is a proclamation that once spoken could be cited back to the ruler who spoke it. That is the seed of law in a city that knows how often a steward becomes a thief. The courts where such matters were heard stood at the temple gate or in administrative rooms near the sacred precinct. Panels of judges sat with the city scribe to note the terms and the verdict. Decisions were sometimes copied on foundation cones or on commemorative tablets and set into walls so that a future official would read them every time he crossed a threshold. When cities quarreled, they brought boundary stones and old decision tablets to a third place for judgment. Mesalim of Kish once drew a line between Lagash and Umma and set a stele to mark it. Later, Eonatum forced his neighbor to swear to that same line and inscribed the oath. The habit of writing decisions anchored peace more firmly than memory could. Titles and offices framed the social order. The city god had his high priest and high priestess. In later ages, an Entu priestess at Ur would be royal and renowned. In every age, a host of cult officials tended daily rites that fed the god and kept the fires tended. The Ensi governed the city under the eye of the god, and the Lugal claimed rule when he could over more than one city. Below them, stewards and foremen managed fields, herds, and workshops. The word overseer carried real power, for the person who held the lists decided who ate well and who did not. Free citizens owed work when called. Dependent workers owed set service on temple lands. Slaves existed and are named plainly in tablets. But in Sumer, the line between poor, free, and bound dependent could be thin and often turned on debt. The market gave room for merchants who moved goods for profit. The Sumerian term damgar names the trader who could take wool to a far city and return with metals and stone, settling his accounts in front of the same scribes who counted temple rations. Religion carried a calendar that tied the whole together. Each city kept a month list that matched the work of canals and harvest to the festivals of its god. On feast days, rations rose and musicians played in the court. Processions crossed from the temple of the city god to allied shrines. Offerings were burnt or poured with formulae that had been memorized by many mouths and then written on tablets for students who would keep the tradition straight when the old reciters grew tired. The gods in these rites are not ornaments. They are the faces of the city's obligations. To cheat a measure is to cheat the god. To move a boundary stone is to offend the god whose field the stone guards. The last turn of this chapter of society lies at the threshold of true legal codes. The habit of contracts, the habit of written decisions, and the habit of public decrees ripened into full codes in the next century. The Code of Ur-Nammu from the 3rd dynasty of Ur begins with a prologue that tells how the king established justice when An and Enlil gave him kingship. It sets penalties for bodily harm and theft, and sets compensation in silver and barley. It is the oldest surviving law code that lays out rules in orderly lines. Later kings in the land would add their own codes, but the Sumerians had already shown the essential move. They took the voice of the ruler and the will of the gods and fixed them in clay, so that a poor man could point to a line and say, "Here is my right." From field and canal to seal and tablet, Sumerian society learned to make fairness practical. They did not end corruption. They did not end war. They did something harder. They gave ordinary people tools that let them work together at a scale the world had not seen, and they taught their rulers that a promise written in clay has a power beyond a spoken boast. Those lessons would meet a conqueror from the north who understood the value of a record better than most kings who carried a spear. The plain had learned the language of rivalry. Then a man arrived who taught it a new grammar of command. His Akkadian name was Sharukin. The king is legitimate. We call him Sargon. Later storytellers said he was set in a basket and cast on a river, raised by a gardener, and brought to the court of Kish. The tale is legend, but its setting fits what we know. Sargon first appears as cupbearer to Ur-Zababa of Kish, a trusted officer with access to the ruler and to the levers of the court. From that narrow place he stepped into history, with a stride that reached from the Zagros to the Levantine coast and from the marshes of the Gulf to the foothills of Anatolia. Lugalzagezi of Umma had broken Lagash and carried the title King of Sumer, boasting that he ruled from the lower sea to the upper sea. Sargon made the boast real for another name. He rose from Kish, defeated Uruk in the field, seized Lugalzagezi, and led him in chains to Nippur. The old text says he brought his rival through the gate and made him bow at the ekur of Enlil. It is a precise act. The conqueror did not only win a battle, he took the seal of legitimacy where kingship was confirmed. From there he moved fast and did not stop. He broke Kish, if Kish opposed him, took Ur, Umma, and Lagash in their turn, and forced the southern cities to accept his officers and his calendar of orders. He founded a new capital, Agade, which later writers call Akkad. Its exact site remains lost, likely on the Tigris somewhere north of Kish and near the route to Sippar. The city gave its name to the people and the age. Sargon raised there a great temple to Ishtar of Agade, for he favored the goddess under her Semitic name, while never forgetting that she was the same Inanna who held Uruk. From Agade, he ruled as king of Sumer and Akkad, and as lord of the Four Quarters, a title that declares a claim to the edges of the compass. His own inscriptions are brief and proud. He says that 5,400 men ate daily before him. This is more than a flourish. It points to a standing core of troops that could be moved quickly and supplied from royal stores, a new instrument in a land that had relied on seasonal levies. The conquests came in rings. First, the Sumerian south, where city after city accepted Akkadian garrisons and Akkadian governors, while keeping their local temples and rites. Then, the eastern marches. Sargon campaigned against Elam and its towns in the Susiana plain, crossed the lower Zagros, and pulled the highland routes into his net. To the west, he followed the Euphrates past Mari and Tutul, and reached the Cedar Lands. Some late sources credit him with victories at Ebla and with ships in the Western Sea. Even when we discount the eagerness of later scribes, the pattern is clear. By the end of his career, the Akkadian realm touched or influenced every important corridor through which metal, timber, and stone had long flowed towards Sumer. He did not conquer only with spears. He knew that a kingdom as broad as his needed ties, that could not be cut by one failed harvest. He married religion to policy with a sure hand. In Ur, he placed his daughter Enheduanna as high priestess of Nanna, the moon god. That appointment bound the sacred household of the city to the new royal house, and it gave the land its first-named author. Enheduanna composed hymns of lasting beauty, among them the Exaltation of Inanna, where she speaks with the authority of a priestess and a princess. Her voice helps us hear how Akkadian rule wrapped itself in Sumerian song rather than trying to erase it. Sargon also honored Nippur as the seat of Enlil and kept its favor. To seize Sumer was wise. To keep Nippur content was wiser. Administration took on a new scale. The Akkadian king kept the Sumerian office names, but placed his own men in them. City governors, still called Ensi in many texts, report to royal commissioners and to a palace that now sits above all temples. Akkadian became the language of letters between far officials, written in the same cuneiform that Sumerian scribes had perfected. Weights and measures were regularized. Seals from this age show the new title, King of the Four Quarters, and often show the king in heroic struggle with lion or wild bull, a message that traveled with every sealed jar and every door made official. Roads and river routes were mapped into stages, with official stops where messengers could change animals and where loads could be counted. The map began to think like a state. Trade widened and deepened under the security of one rule. Copper from Magan in today's Oman supplied Akkadian smiths. Stone for vessels and for seals came from the Iranian highlands. Lapis lazuli still traveled from lands beyond Elam, along the old ways. Texts name Dilmun as a partner and staging point on the Gulf and speak of Maluha, a name that many scholars link to the Indus Valley. Akkadian cylinder seals and weight stones have turned up far from Sumer. In return, the south sent wool cloth, oil, and grain. When a shipmaster or caravan leader could present a tablet with a royal seal from Agade, he carried more than goods. He carried a passport that opened depots and quieted city gates. Sargon fought many times to keep what he had won. Later, chronicles say that in his old age, all the lands revolted against him, and that he overthrew their walls and carried away their earth. This may compress several campaigns into one picture, but it matches the stubbornness of cities that had long known their own will. He made and remade the realm by force and by appointment. He does not name his sons in early inscriptions, but later tradition calls them Rimush and Manishtushu, men who had to fight again in the same places to make the crown firm. The machine he built needed fuel and attention. It rewarded him and it wore him. Military craft changed under his hand because it had to. The standing corps of troops ate from royal stores, which implies regular pay and steady logistics. City levies still formed much of an army, but the permanent royal force held the center and taught the rest a rhythm. Bows, spears, and axes remained the tools of battle, but supply became a weapon in its own right. Campaign season was fixed to harvest and flood as always, yet with a garrisoned network of cities and depots, a king could move sooner and stay longer. Fortified points along rivers and roads anchored the new reach. When he took a city, he spared its temples if they bent and replaced its headmen if they did not. He learned which parts of a system must not be broken if the system is to serve the breaker. There is another measure of his success. He made the title King of Sumer and Akkad into a settled formula. Before him, the south and the Akkadian north had been worlds that spoke to each other across markets and shrines. Under him, they became one realm that could be named in a single breath. The echoes lasted. Later kings, even in dynasties that did not spring from Sargon's blood, claimed to stand in his line by using his titles and by honoring his capital. They praised Agade in hymns and blamed its later ruin on the wrath of gods, which is another way of saying that the city had once stood at the center of their world. Sargon belongs to dates as well as stories. He likely began his rule around 2334 before the Common Era and ruled for more than 50 years, according to later lists. The precise years can be argued, but the sequence is firm. He rises after Lugal-Zagessi. He sets his capital at Agade. He binds the south and the north. He strikes east and west. He fights rebellions and wins them. He leaves the throne to a son and then another son. His grandson will be Naram-Sin, who will carry the crown to its highest peak and then toward its fall. Akkad taught Sumer a new scale of politics. The city-state remained the basic unit. The temple still fed and counted. The scribal school still taught on wet clay. But above that familiar life, there now stood a palace that thought in provinces and in journeys of a month. The plain had met empire. It would never forget the meeting. Sargon left a realm that had to be held with both hands. His sons tried to keep the grip. Rimush ruled first. Early in his reign, almost every great city of the south rose against him. His inscriptions list Ur, Umma, Adab, and Lagash among the rebels. He marched and broke them in turn. He crossed east into Susiana and defeated Abalgamash of Warashe and other highland lords. He took plunder in copper and silver and brought back statues and door leaves to show that Elam would not raid across the plain at will. Rimush speaks in terse lines on stone. He set weights of silver as fines. He proclaimed the number of captives. He tells us that the empire could still answer when the southern cities tested its reins. His rule ended suddenly. A later note says that court officers murdered him. In a realm stitched together by loyalty and fear, a knife in a dark room could undo what a year of campaigning had secured. Manishtushu followed. He faced new unrest in the north and east, and then turned his eyes to the sea. A royal inscription tells of an expedition that reached Magan, the land many place in Oman, after fighting 32 towns. The text reads like a balance sheet, written by a man who understood both the thirst of copper mines and the hunger of the Akkadian workshops that needed the metal. His reign left us a tall stone monument now called the Manishtushu Obelisk, covered in records of land sales and temple endowments. It names fields, canals, and neighbors in exact lines. It shows an imperial administration that could track ownership and rent across a province rather than only inside a city wall. He too died by assassination. The crown passed to a grandson of Sargon, whose name would cast a longer shadow than any other Akkadian king. Naram-Sin took the throne and made it blaze. In his 9th year, if the later year names are read rightly, all the lands of the realm rebelled. The phrase is formula and also truth. He marched from one corner to the other, broke cities, rebuilt garrisons, and then set about changing the way the empire held itself together. He took the title King of the Four Quarters. He went further. In his own lifetime, he let scribes write the divine sign before his name. He wore the horned crown that marks the gods in Mesopotamian art. On the famous stele that shows his victory over the mountain folk called the Lulubi, he climbs a stony slope with armed men behind him, while enemies twist and fall at his feet. Stars look on as if they confirm his choice. The stele is not only a boast, it is a declaration that empire would now speak with a voice that claimed to be more than mortal. His campaigns ranged far. He struck the Lulubi and other Zagros tribes and inscribed his triumphs on living rock. He recorded victories at Armanum and Ebla, in the lands to the west where cedar grows and where river roads lead toward the coast. He pushed south along the Gulf routes, and claims of tribute from Dilmun and Magan appear in later records. Under his hand, the royal road system became more formal. Couriers moved between fixed stations. Governors were set over provinces that grouped several cities. These governors held titles that show both Sumerian roots and Akkadian reshaping. Grain levies and silver dues were fixed and reported to Agade. The language of letters across the empire was now Akkadian, written in cuneiform. Scribes still copied Sumerian hymns and laws in temple schools, but merchants, commanders, and officials exchanged words in the Semitic tongue of the court. Trade widened because the empire made roads safe, and because the palace had needs on a new scale. Copper from Magan fed smiths who made tools and weapons for garrisons from Susa to Mari. Hard stones from the Iranian highlands became cylinder seals and vessels that carried the mark of the king wherever they went. Lapis traveled from far beyond Elam. In return, the south sent cloth woven in bulk from temple wool, oil in standard jars, and grain taken as tax and as ration. When goods moved with tablets bearing the royal seal, gatekeepers stepped aside and warehouse doors opened. A state this broad needed regular units of weight and measure. Akkadian officials adopted and spread standard miners and shekels of silver and standard capacities for grain. This is the dull spine of power. Without it, even the strongest army cannot eat in winter. The story of Naram-Sin also carries a darker text. A later poem called The Curse of Agade tells that he offended Enlil of Nippur, attacked the holy city, and pulled down sacred walls. In the poem, the gods answer by sending the Gutians out of the mountains to break Akkad. The piece is theology and memory at once. It is theology because it makes fall follow hubris. It is memory because the Gutians did indeed pour down from the Zagros in the generations after Naram-Sin and tear up the fabric that Sargon had woven. The fall moved through several hands. After Naram-Sin came Shar-Kali-Shari. His name means king of all kings, but his reign reads like a long siege. Letters from the north complain of raids. Records from the south speak of short reigns and broken lines of delivery. The Gutians cut roads and ruined canals. City lords who had bowed to Agade raised their own banners again. Drought pressed from the sky. Around 22 centuries before the Common Era, climate records from northern Mesopotamia and Syria show a turn toward aridity that lasted for many decades. At Tel Leilan, to the north of Sumer, a layer of wind-blown dust lies over abandoned streets from this time. Rain-fed fields failed in the north. Refugees moved toward the riverlands. The same change in weather would have sharpened the old problem of salinization in the south, forcing farmers to rely even more on barley and leaving some soils worn out for a time. When canals are clogged and levees are cut by war, winter water sits and summer heat bakes salt to the surface. The very system that made cities strong can turn against them when labor cannot keep it in repair. Shar-Kali-Shari died, and a handful of names follow him in quick steps. Dudu and Shu-Turul are remembered, but their power barely reached beyond the capital. Within a few decades, Akkadian kingship was a title without the army to force compliance. The city of Agade itself slipped from memory. Later kings praised and cursed it in poems, but the ground where it stood has not yet been found. That is a hard line to read. A capital powerful enough to command the two rivers for 150 years disappeared so completely that modern survey cannot fix its walls. The end was not a single battle. It was attrition on every side. Roads broken by raiders, storehouses emptied by failed harvests, governors who kept taxes for themselves because no royal army stood near enough to punish them. Sumer did not fall all at once with Akkad. The Gutians did not build a true state. They raided and ruled for a time from the highlands, but they did not rebuild canals or weigh grain with fairness. Their presence made life hard enough that Sumerian cities looked for a champion among themselves. The answer would come from Uruk and then from Ur. In the next generation, Utu, Hegel of Uruk, raised the south, drove back the mountain tribes, and set the stage for a Sumerian house to claim the land again. Ur-Nammu of Ur would take that chance and give the plain a new order. The age of Sargon ended, but it taught the lesson that the south would use once more. A realm can be more than a city, and a network can be stronger than any wall when the network is kept in repair. The Ark of Akkad left a deep mark even in its ruin. It made Akkadian the common speech of power from the Gulf to the upper river for many centuries. It set the style for claim and title. Later, kings who had never seen Agade called themselves King of Sumer, and Akkad and Lord of the Four Quarters to borrow Sargon's light. It taught temple households and palaces to work together at a scale that later dynasties would imitate. It left art that still speaks in stone. The horned crown on Naram-Sin's head is a sign that power had learned to use the language of the gods in public. The same crown is also a warning, because later scribes used it to explain why the gods turned away. The Gutian time left the plain tired. Canals lay choked with silt. Boundary stones leaned where no one had the strength to set them straight. Grain stores were thin, and the road watch had gone slack. The first answer came from Uruk, where Utu Hegel rallied the southern cities and defeated the last Gutian king, a man named Tirigan, in the old inscriptions. For a brief span, Utu Hegel held the senior place. In Ur, he installed a trusted governor named Ur-Nammu. Within a few years, the balance shifted again. Ur-Nammu took the kingship for himself and set the standard formula at the start of his titles: King of Ur, King of Sumer and Akkad. This was not just a boast. It announced a program. He meant to bind the South into one order and to make that order visible in brick, in clay, and in the way bread moved from storehouse to hand. Ur-Nammu chose his capital well. Ur sat where river and sea trade could meet, and its god was Nanna, the moon whose cycles had long measured work and feast. The king set his masons to work in the sacred precinct. The great ziggurat of Ur rose in stages of mud brick cored with fill and faced with baked brick set in glossy bitumen. 3 monumental stairways climbed the front to a platform where a temple to the moon god stood. The base measured roughly 2/3 of a stadium on the long side and almost half on the short, a mass that turned the horizon into architecture. Bricks stamped with his name and titles still show where his men laid courses true, course after course to a height that later kings would repair and renew. The ziggurat did more than honor a god. It announced that the South had a center again, a place where the calendar would be kept and where rations would be weighed without fear. He did not build only at Ur. Year names from his reign list great works as markers of time. The year the wall of Ur was built, the year the wall of Uruk was built, the year the canal of Nanna was dug, the year the Akur of Enlil at Nippur was restored. Foundation cones from Nippur, Uruk, and Eridu record that he rebuilt temples and set their rites in order. In each city the same rhythm is visible. Temples raised on renewed platforms, storehouses repaired and fitted with stronger doors, quays dredged, canals recut and lined with reed and bitumen where the water scoured hardest. When a king can claim that a year is named for a wall or a canal, he is telling farmers and boatmen that their labor has been gathered and directed. The priest who recites the year name at a festival is reciting policy as well as praise. The new order ran on counted grain and on measured work. Ur-Nammu and his officials regularized weights and measures so that a gur of barley in Umma would be the same as a gur in Lagash when written on a tablet. The gur was reckoned as many sela, and the sela was a single bowl measure that a scribe could draw with a clean sign. Silver paid fines and rents, and was weighed in shekels and minas on balances that inspectors checked at the gate. Land was surveyed in iku and larger blocks, with plots marked along canals and feeder ditches so that water could be assigned in fair turns. These are not small tidying gestures. In a land where a bad water schedule ruins a field for years, fairness is engineering. The king's men walked fields with measuring cords and wrote what they saw in clay so that a memory could cross a generation without gossip changing its size. He also settled the rhythm of tax and supply with an invention that later scribes called the rotation. Provinces took turns delivering the crown's needs in set months. 1 month, Umma sent cattle and sheep to supply sacrifice and rations. Another month, Lagash sent barley and flour. Another month, Adab sent fish and oil. The administrative center that handled much of this traffic stood at a place the tablets call Puzrish Dagon, near Nippur. Tens of thousands of tablets from that place list animals on the hoof, hides and wool by the load, and the names of herdsmen and accountants who carried the work. Each entry has numbers that fit a standard and seals that carry names the palace knew. The effect was to turn many city stores into one great warehouse, without breaking the local pride that kept those stores full. Law moved from custom to code in this same moment. Fragments from Nippur and Ur preserve lines from what scholars call the Code of Ur-Nammu. The prologue says that An and Enlil gave him kingship and that he established justice in the land. The laws that follow set penalties in silver for bodily injury and theft, fix rules for divorce and for false accusation, and declare death for murder and for certain violations that threatened the order of households. The terms are plain and leave little room for a corrupt steward to play with words. If a man puts out the eye of another, he pays a set weight of silver. If a man lies about another in court, he pays a set weight. If a man violates a married woman, he dies, and the woman is cleared. If a man divorces a wife without cause, he pays her compensation in silver and grain. The code is the oldest we have in this form. It does not exhaust the law, but it gives officials and commoners a line they can point to when memory and influence pull in different directions. The court and the temple ran on tablets, and scribal schools were busy again. Boys learned Sumerian lists, copied model contracts, and practiced the problem texts that teach how to reckon capacity, land, and labor in the sexagesimal way. The spoken language of many markets was already Akkadian, but the language of the law and the hymn remained Sumerian. Royal hymns from this age praise the king as builder and bringer of justice. Administrative archives from Umma and Drehem show the machinery behind the praise. They list teams of women working looms and the wool issued to them. They list boatmen and the barley rations that keep them strong. They list brick quotas for a day's work on a city wall and the beer that follows the sun down. The poetry and the numbers describe the same world from different ends. Ur-Nammu relied on a web of governors to keep provinces steady. The old title Ensi continued in the tablets, but the men who wore it now answered to a palace at Ur that had clerks to read their accounts and the will to send inspectors if the numbers did not match. In Nippur, the high priesthood was honored and left in place, for no king who wished to hold the south long could offend Enlil's house. In Ur, he placed his own family in sacred offices. The moon god's household and the royal household were bound by ritual and by account book. The king's seal and the god's seal kept the same stores honest. The army relearned its trade as canals and walls revived. Gutian bands still raided down passes in the Zagros. Amorite groups pressed along the middle Euphrates and drifted into the river country as clients and hired hands. Ur-Nammu's year names speak of subduing enemies and of erecting victory stelae. Garrisons at the edges and patrols along the main canals kept movement safe enough for trade to grow. When a state can promise that a boat will not be robbed between quays and that a caravan will find water at a named station, merchants begin to risk distance again. Copper from the Gulf routes, stone from Elam, and timber from the upper river returned to the quays of Ur. In exchange, the south sent cloth, oil, and grain that the palace could draw upon without begging a city council for permission. His reign likely began around 2112 before the Common Era in the Middle Chronology, and it lasted almost 2 decades. The dates can shift by a handful of years depending on the scheme, but the order is firm. He followed Utu Hegel. He rebuilt, he legislated, he centered the south at Ur. His end was sudden. A later tradition says he died in battle in the north. Whatever the field, the fact is that he left a machine in motion and an heir who knew how to use it. When later ages remembered Ur-Nammu, they remembered a builder with a basket on his head. On foundation plaques, he is shown carrying clay for the god's house, a king who serves by lifting brick. The image is not merely pious, it is accurate. He rebuilt the physical skeleton of the South, and he rebuilt the invisible skeleton of weights, calendars, and law that let strangers work together without fear. The plain that had been a patchwork under the Gutians became again a single cloth. Ur-Nammu left a city that had found its breath again. His son took that breath and turned it into a long, steady run. Shulgi sat on the throne of Ur for about 48 years in the count most scholars use, from the year we call 2094 before the Common Era to the year 2047. Longevity gave him the chance to finish what his father began, and then to enlarge it until the South moved to a single rhythm that the palace at Ur could name and measure. Brick tells the first part of his reign. At Ur he completed and refined the great ziggurat of Nana. The facings of baked brick were repaired and reset until the corners stood clean. The stairways rose with perfect grade, and the summit terrace held the temple of the moon god and of Ningal, his lady. Inscriptions in brick and in copper pegs name Shulgi as builder in Ur, in Uruk at the Eanna of Inanna, in Nippur at the Ekur of Enlil, in Eridu at the House of the Deep, and in many lesser cities whose shrines had slumped in the years of trouble. Year names from his reign read like a catalogue of works. The year the wall of Ur was raised. The year the temple of Inanna was built in Uruk. The year the great storehouse of Nippur was established. The king put his pride into structures that made administration possible and into sanctuaries that made legitimacy visible. He paired stone and song. The court sponsored a flood of learned writing in Sumerian that modern students still call the Shulgi hymns. In them the king speaks as a ruler, and also as a man who can read and write, who knows the tablets, who plays the lyre, who judges cases, who understands mathematics, who keeps the calendar, and who runs with the strength of youth, even in a middle year. One hymn boasts that he ran from Nippur to Ur in a single day to test the royal road and the stages along it. Whether the exact distance is a poet's flourish or not, the administration behind the boast is real. Rest houses stood at planned intervals. Messengers carried clay letters between fixed stations. Inspectors checked the quality of the road, the safety of bridges, and the provision of water for caravans and troops. The phrase royal road in this age means an itinerary written on clay and enforced by officials whose seals had weight at every gate. The machine that moved goods and tribute across the South became very regular under Shulgi. The rotation system that his father set in motion matured into a calendar of delivery that scribes could audit. Provinces took turns each month to furnish herds, grain, oil, leather, and finished cloth. The great receiving center at Puzrish Dagan near Nippur recorded the stream of animals and products with a precision that modern museums still feel on their shelves, since tens of thousands of tablets from this place survive. A single tablet might list dozens of cattle and sheep on the hoof, with marks for sex and age, the herdsman responsible, the destination of the animals, and the officers who sealed the transaction. Other tablets note wool issued to teams of weavers, and finished cloth returned by count and quality. The city of Umma sends one kind of cloth in 1 month. The city of Lagash sends another lot the next. Officials balanced what went out with what came in, and they wrote it all down in a script that had been taught the same way in every school, from the Gulf Shore to the Middle River. Weights and measures were tightened again. The sila continued, as the base capacity for grain and beer grouped by tens into larger units and by sixes into the gur. Barley rations to workers were fixed against these measures and appear on tablets as a line of numerals that any trained scribe could read in any city of the realm. Silver was weighed in shekels and minas on balances that were checked by standard pieces held in temple treasuries. Land was surveyed in square measures, with lengths laid out by rope and recorded by its canal frontage and its allocation of water days. Shulgi's bureaucracy turned these counts into obligations with due dates. A plot owed labor at canal cleaning in the first month. A herder owed lambs in the spring. A brewer received barley on the second day of the third month and returned beer on the fifth. Justice in this world was not only a matter for the courts, it was a matter of whether an overseer respected the schedule written on the tablet he carried. Law did not go to sleep after the code of Ur-Nammu. Shulgi issued edicts that set fees, curbed abuses, and reaffirmed rights that officials sometimes strained. The habit of publishing a royal decree at the temple gate and copying it for district offices became the normal way to make a change stick. Contracts from his reign show the courts at work in adoption, marriage, loan, sale, and boundary disputes. Witness lists remain long and careful. Seals are rolled with the new royal titles that Shulgi adopted in the middle of his life. After about half his reign, he allowed the divine sign to be written before his name. Texts call him the god Shulgi, king of Ur, king of the four quarters. He set up statues of himself in temples to receive offerings and to stand as a visible pledge of royal attention to the rites. Deification in life was not mere vanity. It offered a frame that let palace and temple households act in concert while speaking a single language of honor. Shulgi knew that cult alone does not hold borders. He campaigned often, especially toward the east where the Zagros highlands give shelter to restless neighbors. Year names mark victories over Simurum and Lulubi and record the capture of their rulers. Rock reliefs carved in the passes show royal figures with foot upon captive and inscriptions that give the king's name and the name of the mountain people humbled there. Garrisons were placed in strategic valleys and in cities of the Diyala region to guard the road to the highlands. Forts with names that honored the king rose at river crossings. To the west, Shulgi struck at points along the upper Euphrates, but the deeper problem in that direction was the slow drift of Amorite groups into the riverlands. Texts of the time call them Martu, and speak of them as tent dwellers and herders who could be clients and soldiers as well as raiders. Shulgi hired some, fought others, and tried to keep canal banks and roads secure without tearing up the fields to build a barrier that would choke trade. That last step would come later under his descendants, who raised a long wall across the middle Euphrates region in a desperate attempt to fence out the west. Diplomacy was as busy as war. Letters and gifts moved between Ur and Susa, between Ur and Anshan, and between Ur and cities of the north. Elamite princes appear as allies and as sons-in-law in tablets and in cylinder seal legends. The court married royal daughters into important houses and called in favors when a border lord grew too bold. Tribute lists from the east show copper, wood, and stone coming in along with hostages whose keepers were named and paid at the palace gate. The south was no longer a set of peers. It was a realm with one court that knew the names of distant officers and the sums they owed. Scribal education reached a new polish. School tablets from this age preserve graded sequences of exercises. A boy copied signs, then copied lists, then copied model legal forms, then copied proverbs and hymns. Some school tablets show a teacher's neat column and a student's shaky copy beside it, an image as human as any in this story. The curriculum fixed Sumerian as the language of learning at the same time that Akkadian grew as the language of daily speech. Bilingual lists trained officials to move between the two. The result was a class of clerks who could serve at Ur or at Mari without stumbling over a term that changed with the city wall. The economy of this golden age had a public face and a private one. The palace and the temples managed the largest flows of grain, cloth, and livestock, but private merchants worked within this frame with energy. Tablets name traders who took wool and silver on account from the palace, went north or east, and returned with metals and stone. Profit and tax are written side by side in the same hand. Market spaces in cities grew permanent shade roofs and fixed stalls. Standard jars and standard weights on counters made a bargain possible between strangers. The court did not invent the market, it gave it rules. The pride of the age shows in the way Shulgi is remembered in later lines. He is praised as a just judge, as a runner whose feet never tired, as a scribe who knew the signs, as a warrior who broke the mountain folk, as a lover of music, and as a keeper of festivals whose calendar held the South together. Beneath the praise, one can feel how the system relied on constant movement. Roads must be patrolled, canals must be scoured, storehouses must be kept honest, governors must be kept wary. The same texts that list triumphs over Simurum and Lulubi also mention floods that broke levees and reports of grain shortfalls that required emergency shipments. The long rain bought time, but no rain can buy peace beyond its own boundary of years. Shulgi left a realm that worked. He was followed by Amar-Sin, then by Shu-Sin, then by Ibi-Sin. Each of these kings kept the rotation of tribute moving and the schools copying for a while. Each fought Amorite pressure and eastern raids with field armies and with building works. Shu-Sin raised a long defensive line against the west that later texts call the wall that keeps the Tidnum out. That wall tells its own tale. It is the act of a state that still has order and labor to command, and it is also the act of a state that feels the ground shift under its feet. When harvests tighten and caravans must be escorted farther than before, a wall is a hope as well as a plan. The last ruler of the house, Ibi-Sin, would learn how quickly hope can fail when kings must weigh silver from empty jars. For a moment in the turn of 2 generations, the South reached a balance of piety, numbers, and power that made a true commonwealth out of a field of rivals. The ziggurat at Ur still rises to prove it. The tablets in museums still mutter its daily arithmetic. The hymns of Shulgi still sing its confidence. The shadow at the edge of the feast is already there. New peoples move, old fields tire. Rulers who do not have Shulgi's patience inherit his machine and then watch the belts slip one by one. The long reign of Shulgi ended with a realm that moved to one calendar and kept its books in one hand. His heirs could not keep the threads from fraying. Amar-Sin held the throne after him, then Shu-Sin, then Ibi-Sin. For a time, the rotation of tributes still brought herds to Pusrish Dagan near Nippur, and year names still celebrated strong walls and new canals. Then the tide turned. Prices for barley and wool rose sharply in the tablets. Officials wrote of short rations and late deliveries. Governors who once hurried to answer a summons began to send letters that asked for more silver and more soldiers. The South was still rich in law and habit, but the muscles that had pulled the system together began to tire. Pressure came from two sides at once. To the west, Amorite groups drifted in along the middle Euphrates with herds and wagons, sometimes as hired hands and sometimes as raiders. To the east, the highland lords of Elam and of the Shimashki line probed the low country and found weak places. Shu-Sin tried to fence the west. He raised a long defensive line that later scribes called the wall that keeps the Tidnim out. That name belongs to an Amorite people. The barrier ran across the northern edge of Sumer between the Tigris and the Euphrates, tying river to river with fortlets and gates. It was a public work on the scale of a canal or a city wall, an act that proves the state still commanded labor, and also that it feared what lay beyond its reach. Walls slow hunger for a season. They do not turn it into peace. Administration showed the first cracks before the palaces did. The archives at Pusrish Dagon, that once listed a steady river of cattle and sheep, begin to thin in the later years of Shu-Sin and Ibi-Sin. Letters preserved from this age carry a tone of complaint. In one exchange, an official named Ishbi-Era, who had served the house of writes that the price of grain in the Middle Land has risen beyond reason, and that he cannot buy enough to feed the troops without more silver from the court. He urges the king to let him take control of Isin and Nippur so that he can guard the heartland. The request reveals ambition as well as need. When a general asks for cities as his payment, the center is already slipping. Ibi-Sin inherited a throne that faced daily emergencies. His year names record victory campaigns, but they also reveal an anxious court. The need to name a year after the building of a wall or the repair of a canal implies that basic arteries were at risk. The Amorite drift turned into harder pressure. Caravans needed escorts. Farmers near the Middle River moved closer to strong places or took service with men who could protect them. To the east, Elamite kings of Shimashki acted first as partners and then as predators. Their armies could move down the passes faster than a levy could gather, and their leaders were quick to strike at storehouses and at the officials who held seals. The final act unfolded in a sequence of moves that the tablets and the later lamentations remember with a clarity born of loss. Ishbi-Era took control at Isin and began to act as a king in all but name, while swearing that he served the house of He secured Nippur and its priesthood. He wrote to Ibi-Sin about prices and shortages and asked for a free hand to guard the core cities. At the same time, Elamite forces under a king named Kindatu moved west with allies drawn from the lowland towns that were weary of Ur's demands. They cut the routes between the capital and its provinces. They took the great granary at Pusrish Dagon. They seized the docks that fed the royal storehouses. The crown could no longer promise that a ration issued in one place would be redeemed in another. That is the moment when an empire becomes a city with long memories. The sack of Ur came in the year that later tradition fixes around 2004 years before the Common Era. The assault was hard and direct. The walls that had been raised under Ur-Nammu and perfected under Shulgi could not stand against men who had already stripped the provinces bare. The city fell. Flames climbed the ziggurat terraces. The doors of the god were forced. The royal family was taken. Ibi-Sin was carried east in chains to Elam. The destruction was remembered in a body of poems that Sumerian singers called the Laments. In the lamentation over the destruction of Ur, the goddess Ningal speaks of pleading for her city and of being turned away. The god Nana is said to leave the city in his boat of heaven. The text is theology, and it is also a catalogue of very real wounds: temples pulled down, storehouses burned, canals choked with debris. The laments name quarters by name and weep for them, a guidebook of grief written by people who had counted every threshold. Archaeology confirms what the poems describe. At Ur and at other cities of the south, late levels of the Third Dynasty show burnt brick, smashed jars in storerooms, and layers of fallen mud brick that baked hard in fire. Administrative tablets stop in mid-series. Seals that once marked steady shipments of wool and oil appear for the last time. Houses are rebuilt smaller on top of ash and rubble. In some places, skeletons lie where they fell and were covered by wind-blown dust. The end was not a single night, but the sack of the capital was the blow that convinced the South that the gods had withdrawn their favor. In the aftermath, the Elamite army withdrew home with captives and treasure. Kindatu did not keep the city as a capital. His victory broke the system more than it built anything new. Ishbi-Era then stepped into the space that remained. He established his own royal line at Isin and claimed to drive the Elamites from the south. He took over the rights at Nippur and used them to make his titles look old. Other city lords did the same. In Lhasa, a local house rose within a generation and began to collect its own tablets of tribute. The map that had been a single color under Shulgi became a patchwork again. The language of the tablets remained Sumerian in schools and in legal forms, but more personal names in Akkadian and Amorite speech appear in lists of witnesses and soldiers. The change had begun even before the fires were out. The fall of Ur was a political event and an economic event. Climate had set the stage. Ever since the late third millennium, salinity had risen in many fields because irrigation draws salt toward the surface when water is not managed with care over long spans. Farmers had shifted from wheat to barley because barley tolerates salt better. Yields had fallen in some districts despite strict schedules. In the north, a turn to drier weather around the century before the fall sent more people south in search of safety and grain. The canal system that had supported a web of cities could handle stress when the court was strong. It could not handle every stress at once when the provinces began to keep their grain for themselves. Armies cannot march when their depots are empty. Walls cannot be repaired when brickmakers cannot be paid. Law itself weakens when the store of silver that underwrites fines and rations is spent faster than it can be weighed back into the scales. Ur's end marked the end of Sumerian rule as a living force. It did not erase Sumerian culture. The laments were copied in schools for centuries. The rites at Nippur continued. The language of learning remained Sumerian, even as men spoke Akkadian in the street. The power to levy every city in the south and to call it to one canal cleaning and one calendar was gone. In its place stood rival houses that would contend for a century until a new prince of Babylon would gather them and write his name in the law. After the fires at Ur went cold, the south did not fall silent. It spoke in new voices that kept the old words alive. The political map broke into rival courts at Isin and at Lhasa. Ishbi-Era at Izan claimed the rights of Nippur and called himself king of Sumer and Akkad. In Lhasa, a line that included Gungunum and later Rim Sin gathered strength along the lower Euphrates and drew traders and herds to its quays. For a century, the two houses contended. Cities shifted allegiance. Canals were opened and closed to trap an enemy's boats. When Hammurabi of Babylon finally took Larsa in the year we call 1763, before the Common Era, and absorbed Isin soon after, the long contest ended with Babylon as the senior power. The end of Sumer, as a ruling people, came not with a single conquest, but with a slow rearrangement in which Amorite dynasties filled palaces that Sumerians had built. Language shows the same change. In tablets from the Isin and Larsa age, the lists of witnesses carry more Akkadian and Amorite personal names. The grammar of daily letters is Akkadian, yet the law and the hymn continue in Sumerian, copied by students who learn two languages at once. Scribes still begin in the tablet house, with the old lists of professions, trees, birds, fish, and stones. They still memorize capacity systems and land measures that were fixed in the late 3rd millennium. They still copy the Sumerian proverbs and model contracts. The goddess, Nisaba, remains the patron of writing. The scholarly city of Nippur remains the chief seat where the curriculum is kept true. The result is a culture that speaks in Akkadian on the street and thinks in Sumerian in the schoolroom and in the temple. The literature of Sumer survives precisely because the language faded from common speech. When a language becomes a language of ritual and of learning, it is guarded with unusual care. In the old Babylonian age, scholars in Nippur and in Uruk collected and recast older Sumerian tales. The Sumerian poems about Gilgamesh and Enkidu and Huwawa were copied and taught, even as an Akkadian epic was assembled from them with a broader arc and a new voice. Hymns to Inanna and to Enlil were recopied with rubrics for singers. Lamentations over the destruction of cities were kept in both the main speech of the South and in the special Emesal dialect that temple singers used. Clerks organized lexical lists in long series that matched Sumerian words to Akkadian words. Later generations would call one of these great compilations the series that begins with Ura Hubulu. To master it was to earn the right to read temple tablets and to serve a court. Religion preserved the old language in use. The lamentation priests who sang the Balag and Ashema songs did so in Sumerian well into the 1st millennium. Ritual instructions for offerings, for the rebuilding of a shrine, and for the taking of auspices continued in the old speech. When Assyrian kings in the far north rebuilt the temple of Enlil at Nippur, they dedicated gifts with Sumerian titles written above the Akkadian lines, a gesture that acknowledged the South as the mother of the craft. Even when the scribal god changed from Nisaba to Nabu in later centuries, the lists that apprentices memorized still began with Sumerian columns. Economy and settlement changed shape while the words endured. The southern channels kept shifting. The Euphrates wandered east and west, and sometimes left great cities set back from the water that had once fed them. In the late Old Babylonian age, Uruk lost its old reach as the river moved. At Eridu, occupation thinned and then ceased for a long span. Ur remained a religious center, but never recovered its 3rd dynasty population. Farther north, new towns grew along routes that favored Babylon and later favored Sippar and Mari. The south did not empty, but it no longer led by sheer density in the way it had in the age of Uruk. Clay archives mirror the change. Great institutional archives like those at Pusrish Dagon end with the fall of Ur. In their place appear archives of merchant houses and of local officials that show a looser economy in which private credit and land sales matter more. The long environmental story did not stop with one catastrophe. Irrigation always brings salt toward the surface. The Third Dynasty had managed the risk by strict schedules and by careful rotation between crops and fallow. When strong central control failed, some districts fell back on barley alone and reduced yields accepted as a fact of life. Farther north, rainfall farming suffered a drier climate around the time of the Akkadian collapse, and again in later centuries. These shifts sent people along canals and roads towards stronger places. The tablets that record runaways and refugees are not moral tales. They are records of a land that can no longer feed all the mouths it had once brought to its levees. Ideas and titles traveled even as people moved. Babylonian kings adopted the style King of Sumer and Akkad to claim the full heritage of the plain. Hammurabi's long code is written in Akkadian, but its form grows from earlier Sumerian practice. A prologue sets the divine grant of kingship. Laws are arranged in numbered lines. Penalties are fixed for classes of people and for kinds of injury. The habit of making justice public and durable in clay is Sumerian, even when the words are Akkadian. Later, Assyrian and Babylonian rulers collected Sumerian hymns and rituals in their libraries. When the royal scholars of Nineveh gathered tablets for the palace of Ashurbanipal, many were copies of Sumerian works that had already been copied 100 years before and would be copied 100 years after. Education kept the thread unbroken. School tablets from Nippur in the second millennium show a graded curriculum that begins with simple sign lists and ends with complex bilingual word lists and model hymns. Colophons on some tablets give the name of the student, the name of the teacher, and the day. These human notes tell us that a young clerk learned to write Sumerian lines that he would never speak to his mother at home. He learned them because courts and temples still spoke them, and because a man who knew them could serve a governor, a merchant house, or a king. Archaeology has added its own voice to the echo. Excavations at Ur reveal rebuilding after the sack and a sequence of temples from the Izin and Larsa age that show continued worship of Nana. At Larsa, the temple of the sun god shows phases of construction under Rim-Sin. At Isin, bricks stamped with the names of Ishbi-Era and his successors show that these rulers repaired walls and dredged canals in the old style while they competed for Nippur's favor. Kilns and workshops in these cities tell of craft that did not stop with political defeat. In cemeteries, goods show a blend of old Sumerian forms and new fashions from Amorite courts. The world changed, but it did not break into pieces that could not speak to one another. The end of Sumer, as a spoken language, probably came early in the second millennium. After that date, it lived as Latin would later live in Europe, as the language of sacred rites and of learned books. Bilingual tablets from the first millennium in Assur and Babylon prove that priests and scholars still learned it and still used it to title their works. A Babylonian astronomer who wrote a clay ephemeris could read a hymn in Sumerian and could gloss its lines in Akkadian for a student. The line that runs from a barley field at Eridu to a scribe in Babylon who charts planets on clay is not a straight line, but it is unbroken. The Sumerians did not vanish. They were absorbed. Their gods received new names or kept the old names with new pronunciations. Their law was recited with Akkadian words, but in familiar forms. Their way of counting hours and degrees and measures did not need a translator. Their schools taught generations of strangers to write their signs. Their cities lost power and then lost population, but their stories walked to other homes and were invited in. The echo faded in the streets and grew stronger in the libraries. When we look back from the age of Babylon and of Assyria, we can still see the shape of Sumer under the later layers, the temple on a raised terrace, the city that thinks with tablets, the law that stands outside the will of a single man, because it stands written, the habit of measuring time by the moon and dividing a circle and an hour into 60 parts. These are stones that later builders did not remove. They built on them and called the house by a new name. The Sumerians did not only build cities, they built habits that outlived their walls. In the land between the rivers, they turned water into law, clay into memory, and number into a language that still orders our days. When later kings spoke of ruling the 4 quarters, they were standing on Sumerian ground, whether they knew it or not. Begin with the city. Sumerian cities grew from temple households into full civic organisms. Tripartite temples, aligned on a clear axis, buttressed facades, recessed panels that caught the light, platforms that rose in layers until they became ziggurats faced in baked brick and set in bitumen. The great terrace at Ur, finished and repaired through generations, is only the most famous survivor of a form first explored at Eridu and Uruk. Around the Sacred Heart stretched storehouses, courts, workshops, and docks on cut canals. Quays took reeds and timber from the north, copper from the east, and stones from highlands that had no clay to spare. The street map learned a grammar of lanes and courtyards that kept shade and moved air. Houses showed standard plans with reception rooms, side cells, brick-lined drains, and storage jars sunk in the floor to cool oil and beer. The city was not accident. It was a plan repeated until habit became culture. The temple economy taught the world to manage scale. Fields and herds belonged to the god and were leased to dependents on terms written into clay. Loom rooms turned temple wool into cloth under the eye of overseers. Brewers and bakers drew measured barley and returned counted jars and loaves. The famous bevel rim bowl of the Uruk age is the poor man's archive of that system, a standard portion held in the hand. Cylinder seals rolled scenes of banquets and combats across wet clay to certify rations and receipts. Bullae with tokens gave way to tablets with numerals, and then to full writing, so that a storehouse could remember more than any steward's head could hold. With writing came schools. The tablet house taught boys to cut neat wedges, to copy lists of professions and plants and stones, to reckon capacities, and to draft contracts. From there, the school carried the first literature, the first hymns, the first proverbs, and the first mathematics that survives in a sustained tradition. The Sumerian script began as pictures and grew into signs pressed with a cut reed. In the late 4th millennium before the Common Era tablets from Uruk record barley and beer, fish and textiles, and the rations of workers whose names are sometimes drawn with pictures and sometimes with phonetic signs. The script settled into cuneiform and became a tool that could write Sumerian and Akkadian and any tongue willing to learn its values. In the next centuries, scribes compiled lexical lists that paired Sumerian words with Akkadian words, preserved long series of signs, and fixed technical terms for law and cult. The habit of writing outlasted the language that first bore it. Long after people in the street spoke Akkadian, the school still trained minds to think in Sumerian categories, which is why Sumerian literature and law were copied for 1,000 years. Number was the second pillar. The Sumerians favored a way of counting built on 60 that proved more generous than than the 10 that fingers suggest. Sexagesimal reckoning let them handle reciprocals with ease and encouraged tables of products and measures that moved smoothly between grain and land and time. Capacity was reckoned from the sila as a basic bowl, grouped into larger units like the gur. Lengths were set in cubits and cords. Land was surveyed in square measures, such as the field called the iku. The same base gave time its measure. Months followed the moon and were kept in step with the seasons by intercalation when needed. Hours and circles divided cleanly into 60 parts, so that a scribe with a straight edge and sense could apportion a field, schedule a levy, or time a rite. Later, ages adopted the hour and the circle whole, which is why a watch on the wrist still speaks Sumerian without knowing it. Law is the third pillar. For centuries, custom and oath carried justice. Then, rulers began to proclaim reforms and to fix decisions in clay. The reforms of Urukagina at Lagash curbed the small thefts of office. The Code of Namu at Ur set penalties for bodily harm and theft, gave rules for marriage and divorce, and punished slander with measured silver rather than blood when possible. The court sat at temple gates. Judges heard witnesses. Seals were rolled. Contracts named adopters and adoptees, lenders and debtors, buyers and sellers, with terms and sureties and curses for violators. When a ruler proclaimed a change, he set the tablet in a wall so that any citizen could point to it. The idea that law can stand outside the will of the steward because it stands written is one of the Sumerian gifts that later dynasties guarded with zeal. Technology followed need and then raced ahead of it. Farmers used the ard plough and a cedar plough that dropped grain into the furrow. Oxen drew these through wet soil at the right week of the month. Irrigation canals, feeder ditches, and sluices were cut, lined, and timed so that barley would drink without drowning and salt would not rise too fast. Boats of reed sealed with bitumen ran the rivers and the marsh. The potter's fast wheel turned out bowls by the 100. Masons learned to make plano convex bricks for speed and baked bricks for strength. Smiths worked copper and then bronze. Carpenters sawed cedar from the west into beams for halls. The wheel itself served potters first, and then wagons and war carts pulled by onagers, long before true horses became common in the land. When a city standardizes tools and measures, craft improves in every lane. Sumer also gave the first sustained literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh grew from Sumerian songs into a grand Akkadian poem, but the Ulmanu who wrote the tablets owed their art to the first tablets of Uruk. Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon and priestess at Ur, wrote hymns to Inanna that shaped the voice of devotion for centuries. Sumerian lamentations over ruined cities preserved the memory of loss and taught later courts how to pray when the gods seemed far away. Proverbs gathered in schoolrooms taught that a clay pot will not wrestle a copper jar and that a word can build or break a house. Arts and music joined the words. The royal cemetery of Ur yielded lyres with bull heads of gold and lapis, inlay panels of shell and red stone, and the standard of Ur with its scenes of war and feast. The board game that we call the Game of Ur traveled far from the south and is still playable by rules recovered from later tablets. Religion gave a frame to power. Every city belonged to a god who received daily bread and beer and who granted legitimacy to rulers who served the shrine. Enlil at Nippur remained the arbiter of rank. Nana at Ur measured the month and blessed merchants who put to sea from the river mouth. Inanna at Uruk made kings bold in war and splendid in festival. Enki of Eridu presided over wisdom and sweet water and the rites that began in reed houses above springs. The pantheon explained and enforced order. To move a boundary stone was to offend a god. To falsify a weight was to cheat a god. To swear lightly was to invite the river ordeal. The temple calendar tied labor to the sacred round, so that canal, cleaning, harvest, and sacrifice moved together through the year. Their science began with the sky and the field. Sumerian priests and scholars watched the moon, tracked the first rising of bright stars, and learned the seasons that help seed and sickle. Star names recorded in later lists link back to Sumerian words. The plough shines in spring, the bull stands in the season when rivers rise. Omen texts began as careful notes on what follows what. When the moon is thin and pale, the flood is weak. When a halo rings the moon, a wind will come. Such notes grew into libraries of signs that later astronomers and diviners studied with real discipline. Medicine and healing rites appear in early tablets as prescriptions of herbs and as incantations against fever. In both cases, a craft took shape that could be taught and inherited. Trade was a web the Sumerians cast across deserts and seas. Dilmun stood as partner and station in the Gulf. Magan sent copper. The lands called Maluha, in later texts, likely mark the Indus world, whose carnelian and wood reached the south. Caravans walked river margins and highland skirts. Boats hugged coasts and crossed to islands. Merchants presented tablets sealed with authority that opened gates and lowered tariffs. Standard weights made a mina in Ur, weighed the same in Susa and at Mari. The temple did not carry every bargain, but it enforced the frame within which private profit could flourish. Even play and burial carry firsts. The royal cemetery at Ur taught archaeologists of our age how a high court looked in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. Queen Puabi's tomb held gold and lapis jewelry of breathtaking craft, lyres, a chariot, fine vessels, and the bodies of attendants who met death to follow their lady. The finds are sober witnesses to wealth, to courtly music, to feasting rites, and to a vision of service that could ask for the final gift. The game of boards from the same ground show racetracks of inlaid shell that later generations still copied. Small things travel easiest across time. A game that pleased a Sumerian prince can still pass an hour today. Gather these strands, and a pattern appears. The Sumerians built the first cities that we can still walk in the mind with confidence. They created the first archives that let a stranger learn a dead man's debts and a warehouseman's pride. They set the first codes that treated justice as something a poor man could hold up to a ruler. They taught the world to count in a way that fits the sky. They filled their courts with music and their shelves with stories. Even when their speech fell out of daily use, their habits stood. The South passed from Sumerian kings to Amorite kings, and then to others. But the house those kings entered had Sumerian foundations. The Sumerians passed from the stage, yet their voices stayed in the wings and fed the lines of later actors. The gods themselves took new names and kept their old work. Inanna of Uruk became Ishtar in the Akkadian tongue and remained the power of love, battle, and royal favor. Enki of Eridu became Ea and kept the fresh water deep and the clever counsel that saves cities at the last hour. Nana of Ur became Sin, lord of the moon and the keeper of months. Utu of Sippar and Larsa became Shamash and kept the measure of justice and light. Enlil of Nippur, whom Sumerian kings sought for rank, remained Elil in Akkadian prayers and still confirmed thrones. When Babylon rose, its scholars wrapped these older powers into new theologies without breaking the chain. Creation stories that we call Babylonian draw on Sumerian temple cosmologies. Rituals that carried the year from planting to harvest kept Sumerian lines word for word in the mouths of priests who spoke Akkadian at home. The literary tradition traveled the same road. Sumerian poems of Gilgamesh were copied in schools long after Sumerian fell silent in the street. From those songs grew the long Akkadian epic that we know from tablets at Nineveh and elsewhere. Tablet 11 of that epic tells of flood, with the wise survivor who receives a secret warning, caulks his boat with bitumen, saves seed and craft, and tests the waters with birds. The story stands beside the Sumerian and Akkadian Atrahasis cycle and has clear kinship with the flood story in the Hebrew book of Genesis. The kinship is not a guess. The cuneiform lines were set down long before later scribes wrote in alphabet, and the parallels can be read line by line. Another tale that echoes is the legend of Sargon. The child set afloat in a river and raised for greatness appears again in the story of Moses. In both cases, an old Mesopotamian motif walked into later scriptures by paths of memory and teaching. Law kept the Sumerian shape even as new dynasties wrote in Akkadian. The code of Ur-Nammu at Ur gave the world a model in which a prologue grants authority from the high gods, rules follow in clear lines, and penalties are set by class and act. Later, rulers from the Eisen House and from Babylon wrote their own codes in the same form. Lipit Ishtar of Eisen issued laws that read like a bridge between the Sumerian code and the longer Akkadian text of Hammurabi. Courts still sat at temple gates. Witness lists remained the skeleton that held a case upright. Oaths were sworn in the names of gods whose statues stood in rooms lined with bricks stamped in Sumerian long before. Education preserved the language itself. In the first millennium before the Common Era, when Assyrian kings built libraries and Babylonian scholars filled them, scribes still trained on lexical lists that begin with Sumerian columns matched to Akkadian glosses. The Great Dictionary series that begins with the words Ura-Hubulu is a monument to this work. Priests of lamentation continue to use the Sumerian liturgical dialect that scholars call Emesal. Balag and Ershema songs were sung in the old language when a city mourned or when a king sought omens for a hard decision. A scribe of Ashurbanipal could copy a Sumerian hymn in the morning and tally silver in Akkadian in the afternoon without feeling that he had changed worlds. The mind that learned to write in this land was taught to be bilingual from the first clay tablet. The cities of Sumer became shrines and memories that later rulers repaired to claim their share of antiquity. Nabonidus of Babylon, in the 6th century, before the Common Era, restored the great terrace at Ur in the name of Sin. He dug to old foundations, read the names of far kings on buried bricks, and set his daughter as high priestess in the moon god's house, an office that echoed the distant day when Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon, wrote hymns at Ur. Assyrian kings rebuilt the Ekur at Nippur and left gifts with inscriptions that honored Enlil in Sumerian as well as in Akkadian. When a monarch in a later age wanted to look old, he did not invent a new god. He sought out the temple of a Sumerian god and set his own name in the same doorway. astronomy and omen science inherited Sumerian habits and names. Star lists that were set down in later libraries contain Sumerian constellation names that had already been used in temple calendars. The plough rises in spring. The bull stands in the season of high water. Priests tracked the moon across a sky they had already divided by counts of 60. Their tables of months and intercalary rules grew from Sumerian calendars that fixed canal work and feast days. The same scholars who wrote omen collections on liver divination and on the look of the sky learned Sumerian terms for planets and stars because the signs in the heavens had first been named in Sumer. Trade networks carried the older order forward even when palaces changed hands. Dilmun kept its role in the Gulf as partner and station. Magan sent copper across the water. The lands called Meluha in Akkadian texts sent carnelian and wood. Standard weights and jars made in Sumer were still recognized by merchants who wrote their contracts in Akkadian or later in Aramaic. A mina of silver on a balance did not need translation. A cylinder seal rolled on damp clay remained a signature that outlasted its owner. Archaeology in our own age gave the Sumerians back their faces and their streets. For many centuries, Greek and Roman writers knew of Babylon and Nineveh, but not of Sumer. The name Sumer came back in the 19th century, when scholars deciphered cuneiform and recognized that many tablets were written in a language older than Akkadian. Early steps in reading the wedge script came with Georg Grotefend in the year 1802, and the great leap came when Henry Rawlinson copied the trilingual inscription at Behistun in the 1830s and 40s. Excavators such as Austin Henry Layard opened the palaces of Assyria in the 1840s and 50s. In the year 1872, George Smith read the floodlines of Tablet 11 from the library of Ashurbanipal to an astonished room in London. The ground of Sumer itself began to speak soon after. Ernest de Sarzec dug at Girsu from the 1870s and brought forth the statues of Gudea. Teams from the University of Pennsylvania cleared Nippur in the late 19th century and found schools and temple rooms stuffed with tablets. Leonard Woolley worked at Ur in the 1920s and 30s and uncovered the royal cemetery with its lyres, its gold, and the intact tomb of Queen Puabi. He also found a deep layer of river silts that he first took as a great flood, a find that scholars later folded into a more complex picture of many floods on many channels. At Eridu, Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd traced temple upon temple down to the earliest shrines. Each trench and tablet turned rumor into record. Museums then filled with the daily breath of the old cities. From the Eanna precinct at Uruk came the Waka vase, with its procession of offerings and the marble face that must once have been inlaid with bright stones. From Lagash came the stele of the vultures, with its ruler Eanatum and its horrifying exactness about war. From countless storehouses came the humble bevel rim bowls that fed workers and taught excavators how mass production looked 4,000 years ago. From scribal rooms came lexical lists and school tablets that still show a student's uneven wedges beside his teacher's neat hand. The Sumerians moved from legend to syllabus. Their legacy also took quieter routes. Words themselves traveled. Akkadian kept Sumerian loanwords for fields, offices, and tools. Later, Aramaic borrowed terms from Akkadian that had once been Sumerian. Even when the sounds shifted, the categories stayed. A city was still a temple household with fields, ledgers, and docks. Whether the steward spoke Sumerian or Akkadian or Aramaic. A ruler still sought the blessing of a god at Nippur or Babylon before claiming the old formula king of Sumer and Akkad. A scribe still learned to think in tables of 60 before he could serve at a court. In the end, the Sumerians remained present as foundations. Their cities taught later builders how to stack clay until it speaks to the horizon. Their schools taught later courts that a promise written on a tablet can instruct a judge who has never met the signer. Their law taught later kings that justice can wear a prologue and a list and still bind the steward who reads it. Their number taught later astronomers how to count the steps of the moon. Their poems taught later writers how to speak of friendship and loss in a voice that can cross 3,000 years. Modern readers met them late and found that part of their own house was older than they had guessed. When George Smith sounded out the floodlines, he was not awakening a dead world. He was hearing the oldest part of his own tradition speak in another tongue. When Woolley brushed away dust from the lyre with the golden bull head, he was not only opening a royal grave, he was finding a court where music had duties, where bread and beer were counted, where a steward could point to a brick and name the king who laid it. The echo that began in a reed house at Eridu moved through Babylonian schools, through Assyrian libraries, through the chancelleries of Persian satraps, through the notes of Greek travelers who did not know the old name, and then into the notebooks of scholars and the galleries of museums. That is how a first civilization endures, not by a line of kings alone, and not by one perfect city, but by habits that other peoples adopt because they work. A calendar that fits canal and harvest. A script that can hold a contract so tight that a liar cannot wriggle free. A measure that fits barley and beer and time. A song that teaches courage and grief to whoever hears it. The Sumerians gave these to the world, and the world has used them ever since.